that's what the rest of tonight is supposed to be about. So, what were they thinking? Most of us who have seen anything about the history of life have seen a picture something like this. We see many pictures of trees of life. Let me very briefly tell you what this is, in case it's not familiar. Every name here at the end, elegant things like methanosarcina and entoamoebae, these are big groups of organisms. The tree is basically much too small for me to be able to show individual organisms. And as we go down any of these lines, what you're seeing is the history that led up to the organism as it is today. So when you see then two lines that become one line in the past, the idea is that two things that are today different once had an ancestor that was a single thing. So one could easily talk for days about just this tree. There's so much interesting to know about it. I'll mention only a few things. One, this is a representation of data that says that everything we know about in the earth is related to everything else. And as far as we can tell, everything that's around today came at some point from one single form that was a bottleneck from which the survivors descended. Now, to give you a sense of scale, everything that you can see without a microscope is these three little branches here, the plants, animals, and the fungi. So the rest of what is alive in the world is individual cells. Now, I couldn't make this dot small enough to only cover all of human history, so it's about 10 times too big for that. And it's kind of a useful thing to give us a sense of what part people are in the natural world. And, you know, not only scientifically, but also as human beings. But the thing that I really want to point out to you about trees that's important is that the only time similarities, and that's what these trees are, I should mention. The trees are trees of family resemblances. You see a trait that's in two things and not anywhere else. You infer that those two things, that the trait came from a time when those two things were once a single population of organisms. Now, the only way having the same trait implies that you're related to the others that have the trait is if that is infinitely accidental. So this is the reason you can't use skin darkness to figure out who's related to whom. Because as soon as you move toward the equator, you have to get darker to survive. You move away from the equator, you have to get lighter to survive. So these things can change so fast, and they can change in so many ways, that they're not good guides to what is related to what. So the only time family resemblances imply a tree is when the change along these branches is in characters that are so rare that it's amazing they ever occurred, and if they're lost, they're gone forever. So the reason Gould sees accident is that Gould's life was understanding the structure and the relations of this tree, which is a thing that emphasizes the accidental parts of life. But we still have to understand why anything about life is so accidental that it would make a tree, that the family relations would be that. And to understand that, we have to go down to the molecular level. So this is now the world of Crick and Monod. What Crick discovered with the double helix structure of DNA was that you have a positive and a negative of the same information, which can be split and copied without being used up. And that's how changes can be passed on from a mother to a daughter when, in the case of cells, the mother divides. Now, at the same time, either the positive or the negative can be used as a source of instructions to control the cell, and that's how the hereditary information that's passed down is expressed in us. But The thing that's important here is this is like a company whose commander only gives commands and never listens to feedback. The only way you know whether they were good ideas or not is whether the company lives or dies. This is what implies accident, because it says that it's only the accidental changes in the course of living or in the course of dividing that cause organisms to gradually change, and then those changes are inherited, and the only thing that determines what we see today is which changes lived and which ones didn't. This is Darwin's idea. And of course, what Crick and Watson recognized is that this is the molecular basis that gives substance to Darwin's empirical observations. But I'll point out to you here, this is the description of life at the level of control and inheritance. And of course, if we have, a moment of common sense, we remember that there's more to life than control. And so what I want to do is now broaden the picture, ask what else is in life, and then start to dig down in a different area that maybe is more fruitful. Okay, so what I want to show you here, life is not just one thing. It's not just one level of structure or just one kind of organization. It's many things, and they're all different, and they all work together. So just to kind of give you a lay of the land, I'll review what some of them are, and then I'll tell you which ones I want to focus on. First thing, life lives in the non-living world of rocks and the atmosphere. And in the non-living world, your carbon comes in the form of carbon dioxide molecules mostly. That's what these little stunted butterflies are supposed to be, pictures of carbon dioxide. So the first thing life has to do is make carbon-carbon bonds, which it does by making a certain set of small molecules. Not many of these, about 250, and they're not very big, between 5 and 20 carbon atoms. So this is a whole structure of chemistry that's called core metabolism. And that'll be the hero of our story tonight. But for a moment, let me go on. You make little atoms one carbon at a time. When you make big atoms, you do something different. You stitch the little atoms together like beads on a necklace. And this is where you get the big molecules, the DNA and the proteins that can have tens or hundreds of thousands of atoms, in some cases even millions. Of course, that's not all. The big molecules have to be physically stuck together to make the structures of cells. That's a different organizational problem. Now, for some living things, that's as far as it goes. You're one cell and that's your life. For others, you get many cells that group together to make a plant or an animal. That's another problem of organization. For most of us, we live in an ecosystem where we have relations to all the other organisms. That's another problem of coordination and organization. And then the ecosystems together on the Earth feed back and change its basic geological chemistry. So all this is going on. These things are very different in their dynamics. So we shouldn't be thinking that one idea of control explains all of them. And the remarkable thing is, if we look at these things from the perspective of chance and necessity, we find that, in fact, they lay at very different places. So the benchmark for what I'll call necessity is the chemistry of the rocks and the atmosphere and the oceans. On any planet like the Earth, it's going to be the same. There's not much that's accidental to it. It's very steady. We can predict what the minerals are, and we understand it with our science. Now, at the opposite end of this is any individual species. The fact that there should happen to have been a large flightless pigeon on Mauritius is an infinite accident. And the fact that it didn't survive, unfortunately, is the most likely thing. This is Gould's world of contingency, all the things that almost never were and never will be again. And here, of course, they're variable. They fluctuate like crazy. This is Doug Irwin's lecture a few months ago on extinctions. And we have a hard time predicting them. So this is Gould, Monod, and Crick, their statements. But here's what's neat. Biology is not all piled up against the contingent end. If I ask about the small molecules here, these are almost as steady as the chemistry of the rocks. The same set of about 250 of them is in every living thing in the world and appears to have been the same for all of history, almost 4 billion years. So it's like a feature of the geosphere. DNA? Well, chemically DNA has been around probably since fairly close to the beginning, and RNA even closer than that. But when this contains instructions for how to make these chemicals, the instructions can change all over the place. The chemicals do not change, and the pathways do not change. So all of a sudden, control is looking like maybe it's not the most important thing. Maybe getting the answer is the important thing, and you have some freedom in how you do it with control. Cells are fairly regular, but there's a significant amount of variability in them over history. And ecosystems, if I could have drawn them, should cover this entire span, because the accidents of how we live together in an ecosystem are among the most fragile things that are parts of life. And yet the chemistry of ecosystems, which is the chemistry of these molecules, goes all the way back here to the oldest things we know. So in fact, if we want to understand the predictable parts of life, we should be looking at metabolism as the bridge between the rock chemistry and the early stages of life, and the part that we can predict. But in order to do that, we need a science of metabolism, which is going to be different from the science of control. So let me start back looking at the things that are alive again, and show you how you would think about their organization in metabolic terms. Turns out 2 questions will answer a huge fraction of what you need to know. One is where you get your energy, and the second is, do you depend on other living things for your own survival? And there are 2 choices to each. So, Biochemistry 101 in 30 seconds. All of life is driven by energetic electrons. And the only question about where you get your energy is where you get your electrons. There turn out to be 2 choices. There are molecules that release energy by giving electrons away, and the metabolisms that run on that energy are what I call reductive here. And both of these are of that kind. And I'll tell you what they are in a minute. This little guy lives at almost the temperature of boiling water in volcanoes under the deep sea. This is botulism, which when I was a kid was not a cosmetic, it was a deadly poison that you tried not to get in your canned goods. The other option, besides reductive metabolisms, are oxidative metabolisms, where the energy comes from pulling electrons to the environment. Oxidative metabolisms are things like the blue-green algae that give the ocean its greenish color, and everything most people think about life is down in this corner. The animals, the plants, the fungi, everything big enough to see without a microscope. Now here's the interesting thing. The oxygen in the world that is the foundation for this way of life was produced by living things. It was not always here. So this whole way of life didn't exist at the beginning of the world, and didn't exist at significant complexity until quite late, probably half of the age of the Earth. Okay? Now, the other distinction we can make is whether or not you need anything else in the world. There are organisms, both of these kinds, which basically can do every chemical thing they need in a world with no other living thing. What a life it must be, especially if you're just one cell. You know, no communication, no competition, but they can do what none of the rest of us can do. These guys are called autotrophs, from the Greek roots meaning self-feeding. The alternative to being an autotroph is to be a heterotroph. You have to live in an ecology because your own chemistry is incomplete, and you have to have the ecology providing things for you. And we, of course, are the ultimate heterotrophs. We need everything. But in fact, what I did here was a little bit of a sleight of hand. I did the thing people always do. I looked at individual species and individual organisms. That wasn't the right thing to do. It turns out to be a distraction. Because if I look at the ecosystem level, the whole ecology together, things become even simpler. By definition, every ecology, because it's self-contained, has to do all of its own chemistry. So every ecology is autotrophic. The remarkable thing that you get from studying biochemistry is the knowledge that other than this division, there's essentially no variability at the ecosystem level in the chemistry of life, which means that, this is the Tolstoy quote, all autotrophic ecosystems are essentially alike, but every heterotrophic organism is heterotrophic in its own way. So, if you are a reductive ecology, like one of these sulfur swamps that you get in volcanic hot springs, then you're living off of electrons that come from the geochemical reactions. If you're an oxidative ecology, there's a little bit more variability. You're living ultimately off of energy that comes from sunlight and the ability to produce oxygen. But here's the more remarkable thing. Chemically, these things look like opposites. Either the environment gives you electrons or it pulls them in. It turns out that in the structure of life, this is not just an opposition, it's a hierarchy. Because the universal chemistry that is in these guys is a subset of what's in these guys. Oxidative life is reductive life wrapped up in a spacesuit that's able to capture sunlight. So what that means is that even though on the Earth today there are environments with almost no oxygen down in the deep seas around volcanoes, and environments with lots of oxygen, like up here where we live, you can also look at this as a picture back in time. Because back at the very beginning, when there was not yet life to have made oxygen, the only kind of life there was the reductive life. And in these very simple organisms, basically building biomass is enough to be alive. This may have happened as long as almost 4 billion years ago, within a couple 100 million years of when the ocean stopped boiling off. So it basically was a snap of a finger. It happened as quickly as it could. Probably somewhat later, and this is the biggest uncertainty in the talk, when this happened is unknown to 1 billion years or more. But at some point, organisms started to realize that there was huge energy in sunlight if they could capture it. And they started to couple that to building their core metabolism, and they started producing oxygen. Took a long time, though, for the oxygen to build up, and only when there was a lot did you start getting the things we think about as life, complex cell forms, multi-cell organisms, all that stuff. Now, here's the striking thing. Oxygen, when it first was introduced, was a waste product. It was a worse poison for life than anything any of us has ever imagined. And yet, this chemistry did not end. It was preserved, and it has been preserved all the way up to the present. So,